Everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Evolving Activist. I'm Lauren Morn, and I just got back from a screening of the new movie by Thomas Wade Jackson called A Prayer for Compassion, a documentary. And I am pretty inspired. It was not a surprising movie in that um, he explores um, a lot of different spiritual practices and different religious movements, and looks at um, really the root of them, right? Which is really the root of all higher spiritual practices is love and compassion. That's something that all of the major religions and spiritual practices have at their core, is love and compassion. And so Thomas Jackson was really kind of inspired by the birth of his daughter to look at all sorts of issues. How can he make the world a better place for his daughter? What kind of world is she going to grow up in? And he went on a journey to explore this a little bit. Spoke to a lot of spiritual leaders, and really came to he was actually at the showing of the movie, and his message is truly one of love and acceptance and non-judgment. And at the end of it, where most spiritual practices will come back to, we are an aspect of the divine, or we're made in God's image. And what that comes back to is our true nature. Our true nature is compassion and mercy and justice and fairness and love. And when we're out of alignment with that true nature, we start to see the perversions of the spiritual practices that we're seeing in the world today, where we see a path that is laid out along a message of love and compassion, but is actually not living that. So you'll see a lot of people who profess to be one or another religion, but they're disconnected from their compassion. They're disconnected from their empathy. And he made a really good point. We've all been there at some point. Most of us have been in that position of being disconnected from our true nature. And when we're out of alignment with our true nature, that's when we're in suffering, even though we might not think of it that way. But that's where we start to pursue things like numbing, like consumerism, like appetite satisfaction, because we're not in alignment with our true nature. And that really resonates with me. I feel that my highest value, my number one driving value, is compassion. And when I think about living out of alignment with compassion, that is living a life where I exclude others, where I exploit others, where I oppress others. And to me, compassion is species agnostic. If compassion is incomplete, they say compassion is incomplete if it doesn't extend to yourself. And I truly fully believe that. And I also truly fully believe that compassion is incomplete when it doesn't extend to all beings. And I think something that he brought up that resonated with me was the idea of not holding people in judgment, not holding judgment, because when it comes down to it, we're all indoctrinated into this culture of disconnect from our true selves. We're indoctrinated into a culture of shame and unworthiness. We're indoctrinated into, at every turn, this belief that happiness lies outside us. And so we have to pursue it. We have to get something to make us happy, which is a myth, obviously, because nothing can make us anything. We can choose to be happy. We can choose to follow a path that is a path, for me, of peace, alignment with our values. And it was just really interesting to me because, you know, at the end of the movie, he talked about this philosophy of just love everybody, and my heart sings when I think of that. And he talked about how getting back into alignment does bring a very deep peace, and I agree, it does. There's nothing quite like feeling that you're living in congruence or in alignment with your values. There's no dissonance that's making you feel uneasy or that something is not sitting quite right. But as he was talking, I was thinking, but that's all well and good to love and to withhold judgment and to do our bit, right? And to really to walk the talk, right? If we're going to follow a spiritual practice, most religions, if not all, come back to a root of love and compassion. So therefore, we should be extending that love and compassion to all. Not getting caught up in the doctrine, but getting caught up in the truth of the spiritual path. But I was thinking, oh, I love that. And I love the affirmative choice of a path that leads to peace through love and compassion. And also, how do we deal with this despair? How do we deal with this overwhelm that comes from when we look around, seeing the world living in such a state of dissonance, of such a state of complete disconnect, and the scale of it. And as the discussion went on, some thoughts kind of started forming in my head. So first of all, he did make a really good point of when we focus on justice, we want to fight. But when we focus on love, we act with compassion. And I think that if we could lead with love, justice would follow. The other thing I was thinking about was, when we get overwhelmed, when we get into that state of despair at the injustices in the world, the oppression and the violence and just the destruction and degradation, a couple of things come to mind. One is the drama triangle, right? Persecutor, victim, and rescuer. And when we are finding ourselves full of despair at all of the suffering in the world, what we're doing is we're aligning with the victim role. And once we start to do that, then we start to look for ways to justify that positioning by looking for perpetrators, by seeking to be rescued by something outside of ourselves. And that can become very unhealthy very quickly. So something to consider there, like how can we flip out of that drama role, right? How can we move away from that victim or victim by proxy quite often, because we may be feeling the anguish or the outrage on behalf of somebody else or some other being, or many others, right? Of any species. but we're kind of taking on that victim role by proxy. And then it becomes a path to justification rather than a path to peace. So how do we get out of that? There are a few ways that we can do that. And, as I was driving home, I was thinking about that and thinking, well, one of the things that Thomas said was to have compassion for the suffering. And when he said it, he had a much more global idea. It's not just have compassion for those who are suffering at the hands of others, but have compassion for all beings who are suffering, which is to say all beings who are out of alignment with their true selves, not connected to their compassion or their mercy, and also for the beings who are being abused or oppressed or exploited by the people who are out of alignment. So to extend our compassion for the suffering of all beings. And by extension, when we extend our suffering, our compassion, when we extend our compassion to include the suffering of all beings, it, I think, takes some of the judgment, the rush to judgment out of the picture. Because you can't be sitting in judgment of somebody and holding them in true compassion at the same time. I don't believe that those two states can sit concurrently. And so I think when we find ourselves getting judgy about people or getting judgy about situations, we've fallen out of compassion. And the work then is for us to bring ourselves back into compassion so that we can then come at this from a perspective of love and mercy, right? The other thing that came up for me was the idea of attachment. I think a lot of the time we fall into these feelings of despair when we become overly attached to the outcome of our own actions. So when we start to think, I'm not doing enough, I need to see this change in the world, I need people to be the way that I need them to be, I need them to start acting the way I want them to be. And so that need for a specific outcome starts to create its own suffering in and of itself, because we don't have control over the outcome. We have control over our actions and what we do. And yes, we have a responsibility to speak up for justice, to speak up for kindness and for mercy and compassion, and to act consistently in accordance with our values. And if we can hold ourselves in that place of compassion and non-judgment, stay away from the victim role, and then we start getting attached to an outcome, it all falls in a heap. We start to lose our compassion. We start to judge. We start to get angry. Why aren't you doing it my way? What happens, interestingly enough, then, is that we've just flipped ourselves into the perpetrator role on that drama triangle, right? Because then it's like judging. Why aren't you doing it the way that I want you to do? Or rescuer, right? If only you would do it the way I want you to do it, then all would be fine. So it's really interesting to think of that, of how we shift our, we hop from role to role, and all that those roles really are a need for justification of our position, because we've gotten overly attached to the outcome, right? If we can really focus on doing what we can, where we are, with what we have. And this sounds so simple, right? It sounds so simple. Live in a state of compassion. Love everybody. Be judgment-free. Extend compassion to all, right? It sounds simple. It's not easy because we're fallible and we live in this world where we're constantly being bombarded with invitations to shame and judgment and self-judgment and feelings of lack of worth, right? But I do believe that there can be a practice that we, and I completely 100% wholeheartedly agree with Thomas Y. Jackson when he says self-compassion is critical. It is a key here. If we can if we can practice self-compassion, there's something about doing that. When we can be compassionate to ourselves. And by the way, there's a distinction between pity and compassion that's made in the movie that I really, really liked. It's pity is when you can look at something, feel sorry for what's happening, but not make any change and continue on your way. Compassion is when you look at something, you feel the pain in it, and you're compelled to take action. That you suffer alongside, and then you're compelled to take action to improve it. So when we think of self-compassion, that's not self-indulgence, that's not self-pity. It's a very deep and abiding love for ourselves. It's a very spiritual place. And I think when we hold ourselves in that state of self-compassion, it's actually a lot easier, in my experience, to hold compassion for others. And then the beautiful, beautiful thing that he talked about, which I love because this is something that I'm trying to live into, was the idea of being present, open, and vulnerable in our activism. To be really, really, truly present. What does that mean? That means to be 100% there. When we're having a conversation, to be 100% engaged, to listen, to hold space for the other person's story and suffering, right? And their internal struggle and their defenses and the desire not to see or to change, right? Because that's driven by fear or need, right? They need to still belong to their tribe. They need to feel safe. They need to be accepted. They need to whatever, right? They fear the change. They fear the loss of their identity. They fear what they think are sacrifices, right? But when we can be in a state of full compassion for ourselves, we start to be able to extend it out to other people. And in that space of full presence, in Gestalt we call it contact. When your energy field is in full contact with the other person's energy field, you are 100% right there with them. In that place, you can be open with them. And you can be vulnerable with them. And a reminder that vulnerability is strength. Vulnerability is honesty and truth and authenticity. It's not prostrating yourself in front of them and saying, oh, look at me, I'm suffering too, right? It's just being brave enough to be honest. And when you can be present and open and vulnerable with somebody, you can connect with them on a very, very beautiful, deep human level, or actually spiritual level. And that comes back to love. It all comes back to love. And so when we think about this, and for me, this is the absolute foundation of my veganism. This is why I want to practice a life of non-violence and non-exploitation to any other being. This is what it comes down to. I want to live in alignment with that value of compassion. I want to be merciful. I want to love. And I want to create a world where that is the norm, where people can come back to their divine essence. However you see that, whether you see that as we are divine beings, we are a sliver of the divine, we are a reflection of the divine, we are made in the image of the divine. I want to see us come back to that. I want to see us learn to walk our talk and to find the peace that really is in there. And in my tradition, they call it the peace that passes all understanding, right? Surpasses understanding. It's a very profound place to be. And I'm really, really grateful for this movie because it reminded me of my own spiritual path. It reminded me of why I make the choices I make. It reminded me to bring that self-compassion up, to bring my compassion home, as it were, to be able to accept myself as a being on a journey back home to my divine essence. And when I can do that, I can release that victimhood. I can release that perpetratorhood. I can release that rescuer. And I can just be in alignment with my true self. And when I can do that, it's an invitation to others to do the same. And so my invitation to you is to consider, if you do have a spiritual practice, whether that is simply contemplation or self-growth, or if it is aligned with a religious practice, I'd ask you to really look at your spiritual practice and see where you are living in alignment with the tenets or out of alignment with them. Can you truly be compassionate if you are intolerant or bigoted about other human beings or other species? Can you truly say that you are practicing love if you contribute to the suffering of another? If you do follow a religious spiritual practice, I would strongly encourage you to watch that movie. It's called A Prayer for Compassion. It does focus on veganism, and it absolutely applies to any of our social justice fronts. If we are truly in compassion, we will reach out, we will suffer alongside, and we will be compelled to make change for and with other human beings and other non-human beings and our planet. So my invitation to you is to contemplate your path. Where are you out of alignment? Where are you suffering? How can you get back in alignment? And most of all, right now, how can you extend your compassion to yourself? Because if you break you're not going to be able to help anybody. If you are consumed with guilt for past choices or current misalignments, you're not going to be able to extend your compassion outwards. If you're judging yourself, as so many of us do, you're likely to be judging other people. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling despair, my invitation to you is to turn inward a little bit, to apply that compassion, to extend compassion to yourself. And then see how it can help you extend it to others. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What is your spiritual path? Does your spiritual path align with your actions? And how are you showing yourself and other people, other non-humans and humans? I call everybody people. How are you showing others compassion? How are you showing yourself mercy? How are you showing others mercy? So with that, I'll leave it to you. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your comments and your thoughts. Have a wonderful day or evening wherever you are in the world. And I will catch you on the flip side.